Malika hadn't planned on returning to her childhood home in Brookridge anytime soon. Certainly not this soon and not under these circumstances. Yet there she was on a gray Tuesday morning, standing in the narrow hallway still smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and her mother's old potpourri, clutching the cardboard box the coroner's office had handed her after officially releasing her younger sister Lily's belongings, the word "personal effects" stamped on top in blocky black letters that somehow felt both cold and accusatory. For the last week, Malika had been forcing herself to run on autopilot, calling distant relatives, arranging the funeral, identifying Lily's body, navigating the endless stream of pitying looks and murmured condolences from neighbors who had never liked Lily much to begin with. But now the facade finally began to crack as she set the box on the kitchen table and realized she was alone with the one thing she hadn't touched since the police returned it to her. Lily's old, beaten-up, spiral-bound notebook covered in stickers she'd collected through middle school and clung to long after she'd grown out of everything else. It had survived years of locker spills, backpack disasters, and the chaos of a teenager's life, but it hadn't survived Lily's final weeks. A corner of the cover was warped by something: water? Tears. And the first few pages were crinkled, as if they'd been thumbed through again and again by restless hands. The police had already dismissed Lily's death as a tragic overdose. No signs of foul play. The detective had said in that flat, rehearsed tone Malika hated, and yet none of it sat right with her, because Lily hadn't used in a long time, and Malika had the rehab receipts, the clean tests, and the months of late-night calls to prove it. But even more than that, there was the theft, the missing jewelry, which still buzzed like a wasp in Malika's mind. Their mother's heirloom bracelets, the necklace from their grandmother, the sapphire ring Lily used to slip onto her finger and twirl absent-mindedly whenever she was stressed, all gone. And because Lily had no alibi the night they disappeared, and a pawn shop owner claimed she'd been in earlier looking for cash, everyone had decided she was guilty. Even Malika, in the darkest moments, had wondered if maybe Lily had relapsed and done something desperate. But now, with the funeral barely behind her and the house unbearably silent, Malika felt a twisting guilt in her stomach as she slid the notebook out of the box and held it in her hands, the stickers oddly bright against the dim afternoon light. She hesitated, half afraid of what she'd find, but finally flipped open the cover, and within seconds the room seemed to tilt as she read the first shaky line scrawled across the top of the page. "If anything happens to me, it's not what you think." Malika's breath caught so sharply it hurt. She skimmed downward, her eyes racing across sentences that didn't make sense at first. Mentions of someone watching her, of hearing footsteps by the garage late at night, of conversations with a neighbor Malika didn't recognize, of being threatened, of someone telling her to keep her mouth shut about the jewelry. Jewelry. Malika froze, fingers tightening around the page. Lily hadn't written in her notebook for months. She'd been journaling only in half-finished text drafts on her phone, which police said contained nothing relevant. But these entries were dated only 3 days before she died. 3 days. And they referenced things Lily had never told her, things Malika had no idea were happening in her sister's life. Lily wrote about someone being angry that she knew the truth, someone who lives closer than anyone thinks, someone who told her to take the fall, or else. Malika's heartbeat thundered in her ears as she flipped page after page, each line unraveling a little more of the story everyone else had refused to see. That Lily hadn't stolen anything, not a piece of jewelry, not a dollar, that she'd been set up. And whoever set her up hadn't planned on her fighting back. In her final entry, written in frantic, uneven handwriting, Lily had scrawled a name. Not a full name, just a last name, and an address that made Malika's stomach drop so violently she actually had to sit down, because she recognized both. The neighbor referenced in the notebook lived only 3 houses away. A man who used to bring over casseroles when their mother was sick. A man who always seemed to know a little too much about everyone's business. A man whose friendliness had always felt slightly performative but never dangerous, at least not until now. Malika stared at the name until her vision blurred, the truth slamming into her with the weight of a freight train. Her sister hadn't just been framed. She had been scared, cornered, threatened, and possibly killed. The notebook trembled in her hands as Malika whispered into the empty kitchen. "Lily, what did you get into?" But there was no answer. Just the steady hum of the refrigerator and the hollow echo of a house that had kept too many secrets for too long. Malika closed the notebook, set it carefully on the table, and stood, her hands still shaking, but not with fear. With resolve, because Lily had left the truth for her. And Malika wasn't about to let her sister's story end the way everyone else wanted it to. Not when the real culprit lived close enough to wave from his front porch. Not when the truth was finally, painfully, in her hands. Not when she could still do something about it. Malika spent the next morning in a restless haze, pacing her tiny apartment as if movement could somehow untangle the knots her sister's journal had tied inside her. The words replaying in her head like a broken broadcast she couldn't switch off. He knows what he did. He knows I saw him. He won't let it go. What terrified Malika wasn't just the clear fear in her sister's handwriting. It was the fact that every line pointed towards someone who lived close, someone woven into their small neighborhood like a shadow between houses, someone her sister had apparently tried to expose before being crushed under the weight of an accusation that had never made sense. And the worst part was that Malika had believed it, believed their mother's necklace had simply been stolen by a reckless, impulsive sibling with a habit of shutting down instead of explaining herself. That morning, unable to sit still or pretend the world hadn't tilted, Malika returned to their old family home, the place she had avoided since the funeral, the place that still smelled like disinfectant and wilted lilies and regret. The moment she stepped onto the creaking porch, she felt it, the quiet heaviness of unspoken things. Inside, drawers still stood half open from the police search months ago. Boxes of unsorted belongings were stacked like abandoned thoughts. Her mother's voice faintly echoed from the kitchen where she had cried for weeks, blaming everyone but the truth. Malika forced herself to climb the stairs to her sister's old room, fighting back a tightening in her throat as her fingers skimmed the doorframe, remembering the last argument they'd had. The one where she didn't defend her. The one where she hesitated to say, "I believe you." The one she regretted more than any mistake she had ever made. She opened the door expecting emptiness, but instead found an envelope on the bed she swore hadn't been there before, sealed crudely with a strip of worn tape. Her name was scribbled on top in her sister's handwriting, panicked, rushed, uneven. Her knees nearly buckled. She tore it open and found a single page ripped from the same journal, but one that must have been hidden separately. "If anything happens to me, it won't be because of the necklace. It'll be because I tried to tell Mom the truth. Because he followed me again. Because he heard me make the call." Beneath the handwriting was a single initial, D. Malika's stomach dropped. There was only one D, living close enough to follow, close enough to watch, close enough to silence someone without leaving suspicion. Darren Fletcher, the man 2 houses down. The man who always appeared during block parties with a forced smile. The man who had been helping the police search the house the day of the accusation. The man who had seemed a little too interested in where the missing necklace had been kept. He was also the man who used to fix things for their family. Broken fences, shaky steps, leaky pipes. Someone who always seemed to be around, always stepping into their lives with tools and favors. And now Malika wondered if those repairs had been excuses to be inside, to observe, to steal. The page trembled in her hands. The police had dismissed her sister's death as a tragic fall on the old river trail. A slip, a bad landing, nothing malicious, but the journal shifted everything. If her sister had been trying to expose Darren, if she had told someone, if he knew she had proof, it made the idea of a fall feel sinister, manipulated, too neat. Malika felt a cold sweat gather at the base of her neck. She needed more. She needed answers. She needed the truth their mother refused to look at. When she stepped outside, the late afternoon sun made the street look deceptively peaceful, the kind of warm, suburban picture-perfect calm that hid rot beneath freshly cut lawns. Across the street, Darren Fletcher knelt in his yard adjusting a sprinkler head, wearing that same neutral, unreadable mask he always did. When he noticed her staring, he lifted a hand in a neighborly wave, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. Malika forced herself not to look away. Something flickered behind his gaze. Surprise? Annoyance? Recognition? And her heart hammered so loudly she feared he could hear it from where he stood. She turned and walked quickly to her car, pretending not to notice the way he kept watching her until she disappeared behind the door. As soon as she slid inside, She locked the doors and opened the journal again, flipping to the entries leading up to the accusation, reading between the lines now with a new, brutal clarity. The necklace hadn't been lost. It had been removed carefully. Her sister hadn't lied. She had been silenced. And the man who might have killed her was still right there, watering his perfect lawn as if he didn't have blood on his hands. The last entry she read before starting the engine made her breath catch. The one where her sister wrote, "I think he knows I told someone. I think he knows it was you, Malika. Please be careful." The ignition rattled. Her pulse spiked. If Darren had hurt her sister to avoid exposure, what would he do now that Malika knew? And worse, had he already suspected she would eventually read the journal? Had he already started watching her too? Malika spent the rest of the evening in a state of sharp, vibrating awareness. Every passing car, every creak of the floorboards in her apartment, every shifting shadow near the window, pulling her nerves tighter until she felt she might snap. But she refused to let fear drag her under the same way it had swallowed her sister in the end. So instead, she printed copies of the journal pages. Every entry that pointed to Darren, every line that suggested stalking, threats, fear, because she needed leverage, protection, and proof for when she finally went to the police. Though a sickening thought churned through her mind. The police had already brushed her sister off once, dismissed her claims, labeled her emotional, unreliable. And Malika knew that showing up with a journal months after the case was closed wouldn't magically change their attitude. Not when Darren had friends on the force and a reputation as a good neighbor, a helpful handyman, a man who kept to himself but somehow always knew a little too much about everyone else. That night, she forced herself not to return to the old neighborhood or drive past his house again. But she couldn't keep still. She needed more than her sister's words. She needed something concrete, something physical, something Darren couldn't talk his way out of. And so she started digging through her sister's digital footprint, scrolling through old messages, photos, backups, anything that might contain hints, but found almost nothing except for one chilling pattern. Weeks before her death, her sister had deleted nearly all her texts, wiped her call logs, cleared her photos, something she'd never done before. And Malika realized with a slow, rising dread that her sister must have done it to protect someone, or maybe to hide evidence until she could deliver it safely, but she never got the chance. As the hours passed, Malika returned again and again to a small detail in the journal, a reference to the shed, written twice in the same entry, as if her sister had meant to remind herself that what she needed was inside it. And Malika knew exactly which shed she meant. The one behind their childhood home, still full of old furniture and holiday decorations. The one that only their family had a key to. The one Darren had once offered to clean out for them after their father died. Heart thudding, Malika grabbed the spare key she kept taped under her desk drawer and drove through the silent streets until the house appeared like a dark, sleeping giant at the end of the block. She parked 2 houses away, unwilling to risk Darren seeing her car, and slipped through the backyard gate, moving like a shadow across familiar grass that whispered under her feet. When she reached the shed door, she hesitated, listening for footsteps or rustling leaves or anything that might signal she wasn't alone. And when silence held, she unlocked the door and slipped inside, flicking on the small hanging light that cast a ghostly yellow glow across dusty shelves and stacked boxes. For a moment, nothing seemed unusual, just old camping gear, worn blankets, forgotten tools. But then she noticed something that shouldn't have been there. A second latch installed on the back wall, newer metal against rotting wood, and when she tugged on it, she discovered a false panel her sister must have built herself, a small, hidden compartment tucked behind boxes of broken lights. Her breath caught as she reached inside and pulled out a plastic bag containing a flash drive, a folded receipt from a pawn shop 3 towns over, and a photograph, one Malika had never seen, showing their mother's stolen necklace hanging from a man's hand. The man standing in the frame only partially visible but unmistakable, Darren's wrist, the faded tattoo of crossed nails he always kept just out of sight. Malika's pulse spiked so violently she nearly dropped the photo. This was proof, the kind that didn't need interpretation, the kind no officer could ignore. She shoved the items into her pocket, shoved the panel back into place, and reached for the shed door, only to freeze when she heard the crunch of gravel outside, slow, deliberate, approaching footsteps that stopped right in front of the door, followed by a voice so calm it made her skin crawl. "Malika? You in there?" "Darren." His silhouette passed in front of the thin crack beneath the door, stopping directly at the entrance as if he already knew she was inside, as if he had followed her, as if he had been waiting for her to make this exact mistake. She clamped her hand over her mouth, backing deeper into the shadows, praying he wouldn't try the handle, praying he didn't have a spare key. But then the doorknob rattled violently, once, twice, and Darren exhaled a low, disappointed sigh that made her knees weaken. "Your sister was stubborn too," he said quietly, as if speaking through the wood to her heartbeat itself. "I hope you're smarter than she was." Her blood turned to ice. Then his steps retreated, slowly, casually, as if he wanted her to know he wasn't afraid, because predators never were. And when the footsteps faded completely, Malika collapsed against the wall, shaking so hard she had to bite her lip just to stay silent, clutching the flash drive like a lifeline. If Darren knew she'd found the shed, then he knew her sister had left evidence, and now he'd be coming for her next. Malika didn't go home that night. She knew better than to lead a man like Darren straight to her apartment. So instead she drove for nearly an hour with trembling hands until she reached a 24-hour diner just off the interstate. The kind of place where no one looks too long at anyone else, and where the bright fluorescent lights made her feel, if not safe, then at least visible enough that Darren couldn't corner her without witnesses. And she slid into a booth at the back, ordered a coffee she didn't want, and forced herself to pull out the evidence she'd grabbed from the shed, laying the photo, the receipt, and the flash drive on the sticky table as her eyes blurred with exhaustion and rage. She stared at the photograph again, her mother's necklace glinting faintly under the pawn shop fluorescence, dangling from Darren's unmistakable tattooed wrist, and she tried to imagine how her sister must have felt when she captured that image, when she realized no one would believe her. Unless she got something undeniable, something that couldn't be explained away, and Malika's throat tightened because she finally understood her sister's desperation, the way she'd stopped returning calls, the way she'd looked over her shoulder all the time, the way she'd begged the family to rethink the accusations against her only to be dismissed as dramatic or manipulative. Her sister had been fighting alone, terrified, and no one, least of all Malika, had noticed until it was too late. The receipt was dated just 2 days before her sister died, which meant she must have confronted Darren, or followed him, or somehow witnessed him pawning the necklace, and the thought made Malika's stomach twist. If her sister had confronted him, if she'd threatened to expose him, then maybe that was the moment Darren crossed the line from framing her to deciding she needed to be silenced. Malika plugged the flash drive into her laptop, palms damp, heart pounding so hard she felt it in her teeth, and waited as a single video file loaded, timestamped the night before her sister's death. When she clicked play, the screen filled with a shaky phone recording that showed her sister sitting in her car, eyes wet but fierce, whispering into the camera that she had proof against him, that she'd hidden everything, where he'll never think to look, that if anything happened to her, it wouldn't be an accident. "Tell Malika I'm sorry," she said, voice cracking. "I should have trusted her sooner." And then the video cut abruptly when she flinched and glanced over her shoulder as if someone had just stepped into the parking lot behind her, and the screen went black. Malika clutched the edge of the table, nausea rising in her throat, because the video removed any remaining doubt. Her sister had known she was in danger, had tried to protect Malika, had left behind a warning that everyone ignored. The decision to go to the police was no longer optional. It was the only way forward. But she also knew she couldn't walk in naively, not when Darren had connections, not when officers had brushed off her sister's concerns before. So she began organizing everything chronologically, creating a clear narrative even a biased cop couldn't poke holes in. Stolen jewelry, pawn shop receipt, video confession, hidden compartment in the shed, Darren's access to the family property, his history of manipulation, the timing of her sister's death. While she worked, thunder growled in the distance and rain began to rattle against the diner windows, a low, steady percussion that made the whole place feel strangely suspended in time. And for a moment, Malika allowed herself to breathe, to imagine that maybe she could actually do this, that maybe she could force the world to see her sister clearly for the first time. But the moment shattered when a truck pulled into the diner parking lot, spraying water as it turned sharply, and she froze. When she recognized the shape of the headlights, the dented front bumper, the wide stance of the tires, Darren's truck. Panic exploded inside her, hot and electric, and she snatched the evidence into her backpack, snapping her laptop shut as her pulse roared in her ears. Through the rain-streaked glass, she watched him step out, soaked in shadows, scanning the parking lot with slow, deliberate precision as if he already suspected she might be here, and she knew she had only seconds to move. Malika slid out of the booth, keeping her head low, weaving her way toward the emergency exit near the restrooms, her breath trapped somewhere between her ribs and her throat, every instinct screaming that if Darren saw her now, she wouldn't make it out of the building alive. She pushed through the metal door, slipped into the rain, and sprinted across the back lot toward a row of trucks, ducking behind the largest one as the diner door slammed open behind her and Darren stepped into the downpour, turning in her direction, scanning the shadows again. She didn't dare breathe. The rain hammered so hard it disguised her trembling, but she could still hear his boots crunching through the puddles, each step slower, more calculated, drawing closer to the place where she hid. And when he stopped just on the other side of the truck, so close she could hear the sound of his heavy breathing, she squeezed her eyes shut and prayed he wouldn't lean down, wouldn't look underneath, wouldn't see her shoes poking out, because one glance, one beam of light, and she would be trapped, with no escape at all. Malika stayed crouched behind the truck until her muscles screamed, waiting for Darren to move, to turn away, to give her even a sliver of a chance to slip out of the lot without being seen. And just when she thought he might actually lean down and look under the truck, a waitress opened the back door of the diner to throw out a bag of trash, the sudden slam making Darren whirl toward the sound, giving Malika the moment she needed to bolt. She ran across the slick pavement, her shoes slapping through puddles, her soaked hair whipping against her face as she reached her car, fumbling with the keys, praying silently, desperately, that they wouldn't fall, wouldn't slip through her fingers, wouldn't betray her at the worst possible second. And when the lock finally clicked, she dove inside, slammed the door, and started the engine, tearing out of the parking lot before Darren even realized she was gone. She didn't stop driving until she reached the outskirts of Cedar Lake, pulling off onto a dirt road where she sat trembling, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles whitened, trying to force her breathing back into her lungs instead of the frantic, shallow bursts that left her dizzy. Everything in her life had felt surreal since discovering the journal, but now it felt dangerous in a way she couldn't ignore, and every instinct in her body whispered the same thing. She couldn't just drop off evidence at the police station and hope for the best. She needed to be strategic, cautious, ahead of him. She wiped the rain from her face, grabbed her phone, and dialed the only person she still trusted who knew the legal system well enough to help her. Detective Daniel Brooks, her late sister's childhood friend who'd moved away years ago, but still checked in now and then. When he answered groggily, she apologized in a breathless rush and told him everything about the shed, the flash drive, the receipt, the video, Darren's truck at the diner, everything. And he listened in strained silence before finally saying in a low, steady voice that made goosebumps crawl up her arms, "Malika, you have to disappear for the night. Don't go home. Don't go anywhere he could guess. I'll be on the road in 5 minutes." She had never been so relieved and so terrified by a single sentence. She followed his instructions and drove to an old rental cabin on the edge of the state park, a place she'd once visited on a school camping trip, knowing no one would think to look for her there. The cabin smelled like cedar and dust, and the silence felt so thick it almost pressed against her skin, but at least no headlights swept the windows, no footsteps echoed outside, no familiar engine hummed up the gravel path. She spread the evidence out on the small table, photo, receipt, flash drive, journal pages, and then she made a choice she had avoided until now. She opened a blank document on her laptop and began typing everything from the beginning in case something happened to her too, in case Darren found her even here, in case the world needed a record to prove she hadn't imagined any of it. Her hands shook as she typed her sister's name, the date of the accusation, the stolen necklace, the pawn shop, Darren's threats, the final video. She wrote until her eyes burned and the words began to blur, and only when she heard a car crunch up the long gravel road did she freeze, every nerve tightening like an overstretched wire. She moved to the window, holding her breath as headlights swept across the trees. Then the clearing, then the cabin door, and her knees nearly buckled in relief when she saw Daniel step out, flashlight in one hand, other hand on his holster, scanning the woods before rushing to the porch. She opened the door before he could knock. His face looked older than she remembered, tired and stern, but when his eyes landed on her, they softened with something close to grief. "You look just like her," he said quietly, and Malika had to look away to keep herself from breaking. He stepped inside and examined everything she laid out, listening as she replayed the flash drive video, his jaw tightening when her sister's frightened face appeared on screen. When the video ended, he stood still for a long moment, then finally said, "This is enough to get him arrested. Not convicted yet, but arrested, yes. We'll bring this to Sheriff Nolan first thing in the morning." But Malika saw something flicker in his eyes, hesitation, maybe, or something heavier, and her chest tightened. "Is there something you're not telling me?" she asked, and Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face before meeting her gaze. "Darren wasn't working alone," he said. "Someone in your family helped him frame your sister." The room seemed to tilt. Her hand tightened on the table edge. The truth she thought she was chasing suddenly fractured into something wider, darker, and far more personal. And Daniel wasn't finished. "And that person," he added quietly, "has just as much reason to want you gone as he does." Malika stared at Daniel, her pulse hammering so loudly that for a moment she couldn't distinguish the rain on the cabin roof from the blood rushing in her ears, because the idea that someone in her own family, her own blood, had helped Darren destroy her sister's life and push her toward a death no one questioned was a truth too heavy, too monstrous to fit into her chest. And she felt herself sway before catching the back of a chair to steady her shaking legs as she forced out, barely above a whisper, "Who?" But Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pressed his lips together, stepped closer, and spread the journal pages on the table, tapping 2 entries she'd skimmed before but hadn't fully absorbed. Pages where her sister had hinted that someone had been feeding Darren information, someone close enough to know exactly when their mother's jewelry box had been left out. Close enough to know when Malika and her mother had stepped out to run errands. Close enough to know which pieces held sentimental value and which could be sold without raising suspicion. Close enough that they'd even told Darren which cousin would support the lie and which wouldn't. And when Malika realized the dates aligned perfectly with her Uncle Henry's weekend visits, the uncle who'd always insisted the theft felt like something the girl would do. The uncle who'd testified at the family mediation hearing against her sister. The uncle who lived 3 houses away from Darren and often chatted with him over the fence. Her stomach dropped so violently she had to brace herself with both hands. Daniel nodded grimly, confirming the thought she hadn't dared say aloud, and told her that Henry had been questioned years ago about unrelated property disputes and had a quiet history of debts, small cons, and favors owed that painted a picture she'd never seen before. And suddenly her childhood memories of him, his jokes, his rough laugh, his casual dismissals of her sister, shifted into something sinister, a pattern that had been right in front of them all along. Malika wanted to scream, to run, to smash the walls of the cabin until the truth stopped echoing in her skull, but Daniel stepped closer, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder, reminding her that right now, the only thing that mattered was staying alive long enough to bring everything to the sheriff in the morning. And she nodded even though she felt as fragile as glass. But before either of them could say anything else, headlights swept across the trees again, much brighter this time, much slower, and Daniel instantly pulled her behind him, moving silently to the window, peeking through the narrow gap in the curtain as a dark SUV rolled into the clearing, stopping 20 feet from the cabin with the engine idling like a low, growling threat. Malika's breath caught when a figure climbed out, umbrella snapping open, posture stiff and familiar in the worst possible way, her Uncle Henry. Her vision blurred with disbelief and horror as he walked toward the cabin door with a calmness that made her skin crawl, pausing only to glance over his shoulder into the woods, as if checking that Darren wasn't far behind. Daniel motioned for Malika to move to the back corner of the room and drew his gun, positioning himself to the side of the door, but Henry knocked softly, almost gently, and called out her name in a tone so casual it made Malika feel sick, like he was stopping by for coffee instead of hunting down the niece who'd uncovered his crimes. When no one answered, he knocked again, harder this time, saying, "Malika." "Honey, we need to talk." And Daniel's jaw tightened as he mouthed, "Don't move." The cabin felt too small, the walls too thin, the air too sharp, and when Henry tried the doorknob and found it locked, he sighed. A weary, irritated sound she recognized from every childhood holiday, before stepping back and nodding toward the SUV. A second vehicle pulled into the clearing then, its headlights slicing through the rain, and Malika's stomach seized when she recognized the truck, Darren's. He climbed out with the same predatory confidence she'd seen at the diner, eyes scanning the cabin like he already knew she was inside, and Malika had to clamp a hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. Daniel raised his gun slightly, ready to fire if the door splintered, but Henry held a hand up to Darren as if to slow him down, saying something Malika couldn't hear over the rain. But whatever it was made Darren's smile stretch into something cold and lethal. Suddenly, Daniel grabbed Malika's wrist and pulled her toward the back door, whispering that they had only one chance. Out the back, into the woods, then down toward the creek where the terrain was uneven enough to hide their footprints. Malika nodded even though terror made her limbs feel weightless, and together they slipped out just as Darren and Henry approached the front porch. The rain swallowed their footsteps as they sprinted into the trees, branches slapping Malika's arms, mud sucking at her shoes, her breath burning, her heart slamming against her ribs as the cabin behind them lit up with flashlights. And then a gunshot cracked through the night, echoing across the water, making Malika stumble before Daniel yanked her upright again, urging her forward. They didn't stop until they reached the creek, and even then they crouched behind a fallen log, soaked and panting, listening as Darren and Henry crashed through the woods somewhere behind them, arguing in furious, muffled voices, and Daniel leaned close, his voice barely a breath. "We go to the sheriff now. Tonight. You're not spending one more hour being hunted." Malika nodded, tears mixing with the rain, because she finally understood what her sister must have felt. This terror, this clarity, this desperate race for truth. And as Daniel helped her up, guiding her along the narrow path toward the distant edge of the forest, Malika made a silent vow. No matter how far this went, no matter who else was involved, she would finish what her sister started, and make sure every name in that journal turned to ash.